Today we have something really interesting in the studio. The first portable synthesizer that Yamaha ever created, the Yamaha SY-1. And as you can tell, it's pretty unique. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we talk about all things music tech related. And today we're looking at the Yamaha SY-1, the first portable synth from Yamaha, and we're going to talk about the history, how it came to be, and what it meant for the history of synthesizers for Yamaha into the future. So the SY-1 was actually kind of the byproduct of a legendary instrument, another legendary instrument that Yamaha created called the GX1. And this came out in 1974. The GX1, which was an organ, it was an electone organ, came out in 1975, but there was a prototype of the GX1, the GX707, which came out the year before the SY-1. It was and there was only like 10 made, and it was this massive organ, and I think it had 3 different keyboards, and it had the pedals, of course, and 2 of the keyboards were 8-voice polyphonic synths, two separate ones, and then it had like a solo keyboard, and then the pedals were also kind of like a solo synth. And so really, in a sense, people say the GX707 was Yamaha's first polyphonic analog synth, a very early one, not portable at all, huge, massive, incredibly expensive. But what Yamaha decided to do is they decided to take out the solo keyboard and make it its own thing, and so hence the SY-1 was born. And the GX1 is legendary in that it's associated with Yamaha's most famous synth of all time, or most legendary, maybe not the most famous, that's probably the DX7, but the most legendary, the Yamaha CS80. The lineage of the CS80 is directly tied back to the GX1, making the SY-1 part of that lineage, part of that kind of amazing tone history. And what's really interesting about the SY-1 is it had some really advanced features in it for the time. And you see this in a lot of early synths from the early 70s when people weren't quite sure what a synthesizer was yet. It was being defined literally through innovation. The Minimoog, and I think which predates this, really blew people's mind, and many other manufacturers were trying to find something that was as mind-blowing musically as the Minimoog. And this was more in the line of like the ARP Soloist and the Roland SH-1000 or the Korg, Mini Korg, which were more associated with the organ industry, more kind of birthed out of the organ industry than and viewed as kind of solo instruments to be placed on top of organs as opposed to synthesizers. The concept of synthesizer was still very primitive, and so there wasn't this idea that a polyphonic synth was something that could be attained or something that people wanted. It was still very early on in that whole journey. So a lot of these, you can kind of see the organ sensibilities in this instrument itself, and even in the SH-1000, they're all kind of these flat instruments that are meant to be placed on top of an organ and kind of soloed upon. Pretty cool. What's interesting and unique about this one in particular, Yamaha, in their journey of synthesis, really were interested in how to create sounds that sounded like real instruments, and part of that was the decay, the attack, the complexity of sound over time, and the complexity the response of the instrument to a human touch and how that affected the sound of an instrument. So you find this instrument has aftertouch and velocity sensitivity, which is usually something you associate with instruments in the early 80s, not something you typically find in a lot of synths pre-early 80s. So it has aftertouch and velocity sensitivity. You find that in the CS80, but again, that was not something super common. So that's a unique thing about the SY-1. Its VCO is, again, related to the GX1, CS80, GX707, so it's got a very nice tone, as is the filter. There's not a ton of information about exactly what internals are shared in other synths, so I can't give you good information. I would love to, if someone knows, if you could leave a comment below for others. But it's a very cool little synth. It sounds really interesting. It's definitely a 70s sound. It's mainly a preset synth, so it's not very, there's not a ton of parameters to change. It has an 80 envelope, or no, an AS envelope, just the attack and the sustain. And then it has something called attack bend tone, which I know what it does when you're playing, but it's again not something you find in a lot of synthesizers, so I'm not exactly sure how to translate that into another synthesizer. And of course, it's got a filter, cutoff frequency, resonance, and then it's got a bunch of preset patches, which again was unique at the time. Presets were, you saw it on organs, but having some decent presets was kind of a feature. It was considered a feature. And then you can kind of change what, on the parameters that you can edit, you can decide which ones are the preset, or you can set them to manual kind of adjustment. There's a vibrato, portamento, and kind of a wah-wah effect. And so let's take a listen. It's not the craziest instrument in the world, but it does have a nice tone, and it is unique. So let's take a listen, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts. So there you have it, the SY-1. I have to be honest, I wanted to buy the SY-2 and not the SY-1 because the second generation of all these kind of monophonic synths were way cooler. So the SY-2 is a lot cooler than the SY-1 in my opinion, as is the SH-2000 versus the SH-1000 from Roland and the Mini Korg 700 S, I think is the second generation. They all got a lot better from their first generation, but I think from a historical standpoint, it was more interesting to talk about the original SY-1. Not quite sure how many of these were made. I'd be curious if someone knows that number. They seem relatively rare to me. There's not a lot that pop up on the internet. And they go anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 from what I can tell. So yeah, that's everything I know about it. I'm sure others know more. Please leave a comment below. Thoughts, did I screw up on any of the facts? Please let me know. Would love to hear it. And again, if you haven't hit the subscribe button, please do. We have more content like this coming out. And if you have any ideas for future content that you'd like to see, leave a comment below. Give us a call. Chat with us at alamomusic.com. Would love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.